Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Another ship of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet, the minesweeper, Kovrovets, has been destroyed by an attack from the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Of course, one could say that this is just one of the ships. However, its destruction reminds us of a true victory for Ukraine in the struggle for maritime routes. It is worth recalling that the Russian Federation placed great hopes on its fleet regarding the isolation of the Ukrainian economy as such. Moreover, one can say that all of Russia's efforts over the last decades, starting back in the 90s of the last century, were linked to the necessity of keeping the naval base in Sevastopol and turning it into a foothold that would limit the capabilities of states neighboring the Russian Federation. And after the occupation and annexation of Sevastopol and the entirety of Crimea in 2014, the Russian leadership had no doubts that they could deprive Ukraine of maritime routes whenever they wished. And as we see, this failed. When Russia made the decision to withdraw from the so-called grain deal, the only agreement signed during the large-scale Russo-Ukrainian war of the last few years, the Kremlin was certain that now Ukrainian grain and other products would not reach world markets. And they miscalculated. They miscalculated because the Ukrainian defense forces managed to significantly reduce the capabilities of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet. A large part of the ships of this occupation contingent are now hiding in the Novorossiysk Bay, which, as we see, has also ceased to be a safe place. They are also seeking shelter in the territory of Georgia occupied by Russians, Abkhazia, in the port of Akamchire. But the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation is no longer capable of controlling maritime trade routes. The destruction of the Kovrovets only confirmed the trend that has been established over the years of the Russo-Ukrainian standoff. Let us hope that in the future, the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet will cease to exist altogether, and Russia will no longer be a Black Sea power. And this will be an absolutely logical result of those efforts the Russian Federation made to preserve its presence in the Black Sea by limiting the sovereignty of neighboring countries, through aggressive actions against their fleets and economic potential. And regarding the economic potential of the Russian Federation itself, it is also worth noting, in addition to the destruction of the minesweeper, we see the factual destruction of the capabilities of another Russian oil refinery, in Slavyansk-on-Kuban, in the Krasnodar Krai of the Russian Federation. The attack by drones on the Krasnodar Krai led to this result, which is sensitive for Russian oil refining. And even the administration of the Krasnodar Krai was forced to admit that the oil refinery is ceasing its operations. Of course, repair work will be carried out now, and Russians will try to launch this enterprise again. However, we understand clearly how much money it costs Russia to lose even one oil refinery. And now we can already say, at least according to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, that Ukraine has managed to undermine Russian oil refining capabilities by 14 to 15%. This is a quite serious result for a country that Senator John McCain once called a gas station masquerading as a country. And this, it seems to me, is the most accurate and honest characteristic of the Russian state. If Russia cannot engage in oil refining, this creates serious problems for both the population and the army of the Russian Federation. Furthermore, a large part of the crude oil that used to go to the Russian Federation's refineries is now being sent to the market, where Russia is forced to sell its raw materials at a discount dictated by the sanctions of the European Union and the United States. Thus, the world price of oil decreases. And this means that much less money flows into the Russian budget than planned by Vladimir Putin. And exactly in this, we can see the key to ending the war. Many may ask, why would the President of the Russian Federation even consider the question of ending the war with Ukraine when his troops continue their offensive in the Kharkiv region and Donetsk region? When Russia has enough reserves and resources to continue combat operations against Ukraine? But these reserves and resources are not infinite either. And precisely in such a situation, we can hope that the Russian leadership will realize, an endless war of attrition against Ukraine could become an endless war of attrition against the Russian Federation itself. And we simply need to look for vulnerable places in the enemy's infrastructure. One such vulnerable place, which we all know perfectly well, is the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation. It is the loss by Russia of its position in the Black Sea. It is the fact that Russians are now watching with great anxiety over their own trade routes from the Novorossiysk Bay, because this is also an issue related to the transportation of Russian oil. By the way, the same leader of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, could clearly tell Vladimir Putin that in the event of a continuation of the war, the very transportation of Russian oil to the ports of China comes into question. And this means the competitiveness of the Chinese economy, which has not been in the best state in recent years and is unlikely to recover easily if Russian oil cannot reach China, and thus China loses this competitive ability. A weak spot is Russian oil refining. I have always been surprised when our Western partners suggested that Ukraine should not destroy Russian oil refineries. I, on the contrary, believe that the key to victory lies in the destruction of Russian infrastructure as such. The entire infrastructure that works for the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And if this reflects on the interests of the population, that is only better for ending the war. Because the war must come to the home of every citizen of the Russian Federation, so that Russians realize all the consequences of the actions of their own government. What conclusions they will draw is already their problem. But the fact that the war must be in their homes for a long time is a great guarantee, not even that this war will end someday, but that Russians will not start new wars over the next decades. And finally, they will start answering the sacrosanct question, do Russians want war, with no, and not yes, as they always answer when they feel they can act with impunity. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, and to the Patreon channel, Buy Me a Coffee, which helps develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function on YouTube itself. Victory to us, and peace to you. Good luck.